At the edge of the Spartan frontier, nothing stirred but the cold air of winter. The watchmen at the border fortress of Klesia, trained to spot threats from miles away, saw only snow and silence. But what approached from the Boeotian hills was not an army. It was a movement. At its head rode Epaminondas. Behind him marched not just soldiers, but history in motion, 70,000 allied troops, thousands of liberated helots carrying tools, children, and hope. Farmers, builders, exiles returning to the land stolen from them generations ago. This was not conquest, it was resurrection. And before a single spear had been thrown, the psychological war had begun. As the long column wound through the mountains, Epaminondas gave an order. The army would sing, not war songs, but the forbidden hymns of Messene, melodies outlawed in Spartan territory for over 300 years. The sound drifted across the hills, reaching hidden helot settlements like the breath of the divine. Men and women wept. They had never heard freedom given voice. When the column reached Klesia, the fortress that had never been breached, the garrison commander faced a choice that Spartan law had never written: resist and die pointlessly, or retreat and live with dishonor. He chose to live. And so, for the first time since the Persian Wars, foreign troops crossed into Spartan land without a fight. Epaminondas didn't march on Sparta directly. He turned instead to something far more devastating, a campaign against the soul. Helot barracks were burned, Crypteia watchtowers toppled, slave pens torn open. Every liberated person was a hammer striking the Spartan myth. The Sacred Band, once the terror of battlefields, now planted olive trees where boys had once been forced to kill to survive. They erected monuments where helots had been slaughtered to keep the population manageable. Each act of creation was an act of rebellion. And as the army drew within sight of Sparta itself, burning temples, sleeping in sacred groves, freeing slaves within view of the agora, the message was unmistakable. Sparta had become irrelevant. And for the first time in centuries, the city of warriors did nothing. From the heights of Mount Ithome, the view stretched across a land that had never known freedom. But now, at the command of Epaminondas, it would become something new, something defiant. Messene would rise again, not as a Spartan outpost, not as a slave camp, but as a free city, built by the hands that had once been shackled. Thousands of former helots labored day and night, racing against time. Everyone knew the Spartans would come, and when they did, the new city had to stand. The Sacred Band led the effort. Men who had shattered phalanxes with spear and shield now lifted stone and timber with the same burning purpose. They weren't just building walls, they were building history. Cleander and Theron hauled blocks side by side. When Cleander injured his back lifting a cornerstone, Theron took double loads for a week. Their love, once weaponized in battle, now shaped fortresses. Messene rose like thunder, walls 40 feet high, wide enough for 4 men to march abreast. But its true brilliance wasn't in the architecture. It was in the idea, a democracy. The first Greek city ever founded entirely by former slaves. The Spartans came. Of course they did. But they didn't find a scattered rabble or a shattered people. They found a walled city, armed, organized, waiting. The siege began. On one side, the Spartan army, lean, bitter, disciplined, desperate to reclaim the land it had ruled for centuries. On the other, the Sacred Band, shoulder to shoulder with former helots who now stood as free men, defending not just walls, but dignity. It wasn't just a battle, it was a reckoning between two civilizations. Inside the city, men fought for their children's future. Outside, men fought for a past already dead. The siege dragged on for 6 long months. But Sparta had changed. Its power was fading. Its fear no longer held. And when they finally withdrew, leaving Messene unconquered, unbroken, the war wasn't lost with banners or corpses. It was lost in silence. For the first time in history, Sparta had failed to retake what it believed it owned. The world was watching, and it understood. The age of fear was over. They marched on Sparta itself, not with catapults, not with fire, but with presence. For 3 days, Epaminondas and the Sacred Band camped within sight of the city's walls. Their bronze armor glinted in the sun. Their standards flew freely in the winter wind. They made no move to attack. They didn't need to. The Spartans, descendants of men who once stared down empires, stayed inside. For 3 centuries, they had claimed they had no need of walls. That Spartan courage was defense enough. But now they cowered behind stone. Foreign soldiers feasted in sacred groves. Helots were freed within view of the agora. Temples burned. Fields were salted. And still, no Spartan emerged. It wasn't a battle. It was a message carved into the bones of Greek history. Sparta no longer ruled by fear. It ruled by myth. And that myth had shattered. On the 4th morning, Epaminondas gave a final order. Not to attack, not to conquer, to march away, toward Messene, toward rebuilding, toward the future. The meaning was undeniable. Sparta wasn't worth conquering. It had become irrelevant. Its time had passed. Its empire built on fear, silence, and slavery had been undone, not by a bigger army, not by siege engines, but by 300 men who fought for love, and a general who understood that history is not written in blood alone, but in dignity. The Sacred Band stood atop a hill as the army turned west. They looked back at the city that had once ruled the Greek world and saw nothing but stone and memory. They had come to end an empire, but they had also come to prove something deeper, that the future belonged not to domination, but to liberation. And they were walking into it, together. The founding of Messene in 369 BCE was unlike anything Greece had ever seen. It wasn't conquest. It wasn't colonization. It was resurrection. On the very ground where helots had once been whipped, starved, and slaughtered, now rose towers and homes. Olive trees were planted where boys had been forced to kill. The Sacred Band, warriors once feared across the Aegean, now worked beside liberated slaves, laying stone, lifting beams, building hope. Every brick in Messene's wall was an act of defiance. This was a city where the oppressed governed themselves, a democracy built by those who had once been considered less than men. And the Spartans watched, helpless. Each sunrise brought them a new humiliation. Smoke from forges where slaves made their own weapons. Banners flying from towers where once there had been chains. It was a revolution they could not stop, because this time it wasn't marching toward them, it had already passed them by. Eventually, Sparta tried. They marched on Messene with fury and fire, with years of shame behind them and vengeance in their eyes. But what they found was not a broken city. They found a fortress of love, pain, and purpose. Inside the walls, the Sacred Band stood alongside former slaves, now citizens, not fighting for empire, not for revenge, for each other, for the right to exist. The siege dragged for 6 long months, but the Spartans no longer had the edge. They were an echo of their former selves, tactics without spirit, tradition without fire. And when they finally withdrew, beaten not by spears but by unbreakable will, the truth was undeniable. Sparta could no longer conquer. Its power was theater, its legend hollow, and the Sacred Band, they had done what no one thought possible. They hadn't just defeated Sparta, they had outlived it. The messenger who stumbled into Thebes in 362 BCE brought news soaked in blood and glory. "We have won," he gasped, collapsing in the agora. "The Spartan-Athenian alliance is shattered. Their armies are scattered. Their generals, dead or fled." But then came the words that silenced the celebration. "Epaminondas is dead. On the battlefield of Mantinea, the greatest mind in Greek warfare had delivered his final masterpiece, a crushing victory using his perfected oblique order. The enemy line had broken like pottery beneath a hammer. But Epaminondas had led from the front. He had plunged into the chaos, a general without fear, a philosopher with a sword, and in the heart of the battle, a spear found his chest. As he fell, the Sacred Band fought like men possessed, cutting a path through enemy ranks to reach him. Pelopidas reached his old friend, cradling his blood-soaked armor. "We've won," he whispered. Epaminondas looked at the sky and replied, "No, my friend, we've lost." Without unity, he warned, Greece would devour itself. And as his breath faded, so too did the dream. The prophecy came true faster than anyone expected. With Epaminondas gone, the fragile alliance fractured. City-states turned inward. Thebes lost its voice, and into the vacuum rode a figure the Sacred Band already knew. Philip II of Macedon. Once a teenage hostage in Thebes, Philip had watched the Sacred Band train. He had asked questions, drawn diagrams, memorized formations. Pelopidas had once said, "He learns too fast," and he smiles like a man who plans murder. Now, that smile had become a machine. Philip took Epaminondas, tactics, and refined them into cold, professional brutality. His soldiers didn't fight for love. They fought for pay, for conquest, for empire. The Sacred Band would face this new world soon enough. But something had changed. They were no longer revolutionaries. They were relics of a dying age, and they were about to fight their final battle. August 2nd, 338 BCE. The plain of Chaeronea ran red beneath a sky too calm for what was coming. On one side stood 35,000 Greeks, Athenians, Thebans, and others clinging to the last hope of independence. On the other, Philip's war machine. 4,000 men. Disciplined, relentless, forged not in love, but in order. And leading the Macedonian left wing was his son, 18-year-old Alexander. Across the field, on the right flank of the Greek coalition, stood 300 men. The Sacred Band, gray at the temples, scars on their arms, but their shields still locked, their spears still sharp, their hearts unchanged. Cleander stood beside Theron, his lover in life and in war, as he had for 3 decades. They didn't not speak. They didn't need to. They already knew how it would end. The battle began with thunder. The Greek line crashed into the Macedonians with fury, but it wasn't enough. Philip's strategy unfolded with merciless precision. Alexander swept through the Athenian left like fire through dry grass. And the Sacred Band? They held. They carved through the Macedonian right, as they had done so many times before, fighting not for glory, but for each other. When Theron took a sarissa through the shoulder, Cleander howled and broke formation, hacking down 3 men to pull him to safety. All around them, other lovers did the same. But this time, the enemy did not break. For every Macedonian who fell, 2 more took his place. Philip hadn't brought an army. He had brought inevitability. The Sacred Band was surrounded. No retreat, no surrender. They locked shields in a circle on a hill, facing death as they had always faced life together. One by one, they fell. Not in fear, not in shame, but in defiance. When the sun set, 300 bodies lay in perfect formation, spears still pointing outward, arms wrapped around the men they loved. Philip walked among the dead and wept. "Perish any man," he said, "who suspects these warriors of anything dishonorable." He ordered a monument built, not to his victory, but to their love. A marble lion, facing forever toward the place where 300 men proved that love could outlast bronze, empires, and time itself.